Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Public History with Jake and Justin. I'm Jake Wynn. It's been a year of big questions in American life about who we are, how we remember, and the places where our past still lives on. Today, we're stepping away from the chaos of headlines and onto the quiet grounds of a historic estate with deep roots in Maryland's history. I'm joined today by Amanda Venable, Museum Manager at Rose Hill Manor Park and Museums, and Kari Saavedra, Recreation Manager of Natural and Cultural Heritage for Frederick County Parks and Recreation. Rose Hill is a dynamic public history site interpreting stories that span centuries, from early American politics to the lives of enslaved people and the changing nature of childhood and family in this region. In this episode, we talk about how interpretation at Rose Hill has evolved over time, how the museum connects with the public today, and how they're preparing to mark the 250th anniversary of the United States in 2026. It's a conversation about memory, place, and the power of local history to illuminate our national story. We hope you enjoy this conversation with Amanda and Kari. Hey, everybody. I am here with our two guests for today's show, the dynamic duo of Rose Hill, Amanda Venable and Kari Saavedra. Thank you both for joining us for the show today.
Our pleasure.
Excellent. Well, I'm excited to chat with you both. This is a continuation of a conversations that we've had over many years, whether on tour or at meetings, hanging out, having a few drinks after work. We love to talk about history. We love to talk about history in Frederick County, Maryland, where we are all located. And specifically, we're going to dive in today to the story of Rose Hill Manor, which is a site that is near and dear to both Kari and Amanda's hearts. And they've done an amazing job of interpreting and telling the story of that location, of that really historic place. So before we go any further, if you guys want to jump in and kind of tell the story, give a little bit of an overview of Rose Hill Manor, where it is, what's the historical significance, kind of from a 10,000-foot level, and then we'll dive into some of the details.
Sure. Rose Hill is situated right in the middle of Frederick County. And today it's in the Frederick city limits. When it was built, it was still kind of considered a country estate, even though it's only a mile north of the city proper. And it was built as a plantation house for a man named John Graham and his wife, Anne Graham. And Anne Graham was the daughter of Governor Thomas Johnson. And so this plantation was one of a large complex of properties that this extended Johnson family owned, in a variety of businesses that they had as well. So that's kind of its claim to fame, though before that, it was land occupied by the Native Americans, and then also by a German family that did the initial clearing of the land and the original farm complex. And then it was inhabited all the way up into the 1960s when the county purchased it. So it has a very long history, and lots of different stories within that history.
So one of the things I found really amazing about this site, is how its interpretation has changed. So if you could take us through kind of from the moment that this begins on the path towards becoming a museum, a park, how has the interpretation of the house, the grounds, the museums there, how have they changed since it has become a museum?
When it was originally created, the museum was created in 1972. And as Mandy likes to say, part of the bicentennial fervor. And Governor Johnson was a member of that Continental era, and the Colonial Congress. And so that kind of fervor for creating museums and spaces was part of how the museum came to be. And that association with Governor Johnson really helped us shape the early interpretation of the property as a colonial mansion. And then over time, around 2008, 2009, a mission statement was created for the museum to more fully acknowledge the history of the park that Mandy referred to, with the various time periods, and really looking at that whole 1740s to the 1950s when various families occupied it and operated the agricultural spaces there. And then as we began to do more research and to really look at how we wanted to more fully embrace our mission, we kind of moved away from just talking about Governor Johnson, to really ensure that we were talking about the enslaved families who were integral to the history of the property over the 200 years that it was occupied, and then also the free African Americans and some of the women who later ran a tea room out of there. So we really wanted to more fully embrace the history and do a better job of really interpreting the history of the property as a whole, and telling stories that had been missed for a really long time. So that was a really intentional piece that we started to do in about 2015.
I know that COVID had quite an impact on the research that you were all able to do, the interpretation within the house and on the grounds as well. Could you talk a little bit about how you both utilized all that downtime we had while we were busy pivoting, between everything in 2020 and 2021? How did that impact how you told the story of Rose Hill, of the Johnsons, of all of a variety of people that lived and worked and were enslaved on the property?
So one of the things that we did was really took that time to delve into more records that we didn't have access to, and more records were coming to light at the same time. And we started to ask different questions because we started to realize that more of the family interconnected, kind of like Mandy alluded to. The Johnson family was very extensive in Frederick County's history and owned a lot of property. And we began to realize how interconnected the Johnsons were in all of their dealings and in all of their businesses and then their family relationships. And that included with the enslaved families that they held across many properties and across their multiple businesses. Mandy, I know you're going to want to jump in here. So we really started looking at different sources and documents. We went beyond what we had looked at in the past and started looking at other family letters and other family documents and other census records, and really began to pull the story together in that new way.
Yeah, and I think that first step was the research piece, like Kari talked about. Of not only did we have more time, because we weren't dealing with the day-to-day operations of field trips and programs and things that take up our normal 9 to 5, but like Kari alluded to, everybody was digitizing and pivoting, and so resources across the country started becoming available in ways that they hadn't been before. So the research was definitely the first step, but then COVID also gave us a different opportunity in that everybody that were our docents and our staff had taken a year off of giving tours. And so it was the perfect time to also completely change everything about the interpretation, because it was, a natural break. We had some people that chose not to come back after COVID, because, COVID was still going on when we reopened. So some that weren't comfortable yet being in crowds, some that had just moved on because they had found other opportunities in that span of time. And, also just the natural, you don't go from a Tuesday where you're interpreting one way to a Wednesday when you're interpreting a different way. So that natural break of time really helped the reset button. And then the other thing that we did was we physically changed the space. So our upstairs rooms had been in a certain exhibits and certain patterns for a long time. And we changed a lot of the furniture. We changed whole rooms so that it was also hard for all of us not to go just back into our comfort zone of how we always interpret the same spaces. It's really hard to just stick to an old tour when the things that you talked about in that room are literally not there anymore. There's new furniture and there's new artifacts. And so that we changed the whole upstairs, especially, and that also helped us change the interpretation.
With all that change, were there any challenges that you all experienced, whether that's from docents on site, other staff members, or most we've discussed this on other episodes, the public and their perspectives on this? Did you experience anything, any you know, folks being upset, or were people really enjoying and learning a lot from this new interpretation?
I would say, like most staff, just like any change, any change makes everyone a little bit nervous about how are we going to do this and is it going to work? But as part of that change and that change in that interpretation, we really spent a lot of time leading back into reopening the museum, of giving staff that opportunity to learn, to understand the documents we were referencing and how we were changing it. And so now your tour kind of follows a timeline of the history of the house, and all of those stories kind of blend within. And it gave people the opportunity to hear more stories and not just the history of one person, right? And it really gave the opportunity to intertwine stories into the tour in different ways, and to highlight different stories throughout, depending on what your audience was really interested in. So we can, highlight the women's history. We can highlight some of the history of how the enslaved and the enslavers interactions happened, and what was going on within the household and what was changing in Frederick County's history as part of that over time. And so it's really been an opportunity that I think most staff embraced. Again, everyone's a little nervous when you change something. But I also think and like Mandy said, she'll talk about the school tour side, but I think from the general public, the reaction was it was time that we had done some changes and had created some new opportunities and had told a more fuller history of the site and as a whole.
Yeah, and I think the field trips and some of our public reaction was very similar. We had a few schools at the beginning that had come for teachers that had brought their kids for a decade or two, and we're like, whoa, there are different things, and you're talking about different things. But that was very far and few between. And over time, we showed the care that we were treating the subject, especially of slavery, on the tour, so that teachers that were nervous about talking about it realize, like, oh, this is pedagogically appropriate and age appropriate. It's all rooted in the standards from the state, and so they started seeing like what they were being expected to talk about in their classrooms, melded together. And especially the elementary school teachers who don't always come from those backgrounds of history, especially complex topics like slavery, I think they started to embrace the idea that, okay, here's a place that is the expert in that knowledge that we can take our kids to get that deeper, fuller experience that as a an elementary school teacher we might not have, because we're really focused on teaching reading and writing and math, and are delving into this new world of teaching social studies and these complex ideas. So at first I think there's a little bit of nervousness, or we would get comments like, well, this isn't the tour we've always gone on. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't the tour that we normally go on. And then they just kind of went with it and realized, like, oh, this is what our kids need, and this is what this makes sense for this space. So yeah, not a huge backlash. And again, like Kari said, staff are sometimes very nervous about the what if. And I think that also over time, the more and more that they got those positive receptions from the public, and, oh, I'm so glad you're talking about this, and, oh, I learned so much, or I didn't know this. Every time that happens in a tour, it continues to like boost their confidence in talking about this information.
That's fantastic. And having seen you all do this work as it was sort of happening in real time, just it's very impressive just to see how much you were able to get that public buy-in, and just seeing it, having been on a tour with a group of leaders in Frederick County and some of the discussions that happened as a result of some of these changed tour, topics, themes that are throughout. I was just extremely impressed by just the discussions that this has generated, and something that's really important here in Frederick County, as also a part of a wider national conversation about things like slavery, race, emancipation, but also how you all focus not just on the slavery aspect of the site at Rose Hill, which is of course integral to the story, but also on the free Black populations on and near Rose Hill, and their interconnectedness with the Rose Hill property, and also just with the wider Frederick story as well, the regional history. Just really impressed by that, and I don't know if you all have any comments on that and how you integrated that into your interpretation.
Well, I think so that's the stories that we found over time, and every time Kari and I give a tour, we sit down and we reflect, oh, I thought about this connection, or I thought about the way that the story weaves in another way. And what we found is that for a long time, most of us in Frederick, myself included, had certain pockets of understanding about Frederick history, like you said, that regional history. And a lot of times those ideas are, Frederick had just German roots. Everybody was German in Frederick, or there wasn't a lot of slavery in Frederick, or there were a ton of free Blacks in Frederick County, or, the slavery in Frederick was different or milder than the slavery in the Deep South. And so what we have found really important in the stories of individuals like the Robinson family, that is our family that was a mixture of free and enslaved, that, like you said, lived at Rose Hill and worked at Rose Hill, or were enslaved at Rose Hill, and across a series of plantations connected to the family. And that story for us really highlights so many themes to understand a true history of Frederick County, between the impact of technology on slavery, which a lot of people don't think about, but in the Industrial Revolution and increased technology that's making it so that slave labor is not as necessary, is impacting the region, and manumissions are impacting the region. And so our family at Rose Hill has this wide variety of family members that are enslaved or free, and what that really means in the dynamics of social life in Frederick, and what it would be like to have a family member that is enslaved while have another family member that is free, and how all of those things are complex and difficult to navigate, just as much as being on a cotton plantation in the South. And so for us, getting that truer picture has been really important.
With that, it's, talking about the changing in technology, talking about slavery. I want to take a different tack here and go to talk about the enslavers side of this. We've talked a little bit about the Johnson family, about Thomas Johnson. Could you provide a little more background about the Johnson family, what their industry was in Frederick County, and how integral they are to understanding Frederick County history, and really the history of this region of Maryland and down into Virginia in the late 18th century?
Yeah, so the Johnson family and the Grahams, who are married into the Johnson family and are part of the Rose Hill story, they both came from Calvert County, and saw Frederick as some of the early land speculation in the 1760s. And one of those areas, back to like your 8th grade history classes and understanding like mercantilism and the mother country and the colonies, and the reason for the colonies was not only the wheat production in Frederick County and just land, but timber and iron production. And so the Johnson family had several iron furnaces. One of them was at around Sugarloaf Mountain in the southern portion of Frederick County, right on the Frederick County and Montgomery County line. Another one, their most famous, is Catoctin Furnace, just north of Frederick. And then they, like you said, they also had one just over the Potomac in Loudoun County, Virginia, that some of their children actually ran. And then they owned land and sought land all along that line through Frederick County, from Loudoun County through Frederick County, west into like even Cumberland area, and even north into Pennsylvania, just south of Pittsburgh. And when you look at it on a map, it follows waterways that obviously they would be using to transport iron along, and follows the iron ore banks of the western region here. So that was one of their main industries. They're also involved in glassworks from the 1790s all the way, if not earlier, all the way into the 1830s as well. And so they really used their political savvy. Several of them were lawyers. Some of them were more into the business side of it. And Thomas Johnson, he had several siblings. He was one of 12, but he and four of his other brothers specifically unite all of their different skill sets into making this gigantic network of businesses. I like to call them the early captains of industry, because they worked with, like, how do you get where are you buying land to get the timber? Where are you getting the iron ore? Where you also own the forges and the furnaces, and the glassworks. And one of the things that Kari mentioned was how our research was looking beyond just Thomas Johnson and beyond just Rose Hill. And we started understanding that they were also moving the enslaved population around, depending on which iron furnace was in blast or which glass house was being used at the time. And so it was all very strategic through the entire region. So the iron and the timber, those are their big ones for this region.
I often think every time I'm driving along US Route 15 between the city of Frederick north to the town of Thurmont, you pass so many Johnson-related properties, and you'll see them. You'll see them from the highway. So if you're driving south from Gettysburg towards Frederick, just take a look after you pass Thurmont, and look to right, you'll see Springfield Manor, huge place. After you pass the village of Catoctin Furnace, and all the way down through there, there's so much Johnson history along that route, which is the journey through hallowed ground, scenic byway today. I think that gets to just how connected they were, and the communities that they played a part in building, both enslaved and free, along those pathways. I always just think of that as I'm driving along there. Just a kind of stepping into you mentioned the political savvy of the Johnsons. We are approaching the 250th anniversary of American independence, coming up in 2026. How does Thomas Johnson and his brothers, how did they fit into the story of American independence, specifically in the colony and the state of Maryland?
So all of the brothers in different ways had different involvement. The most famous being Thomas Johnson, but two of his brothers lead militias in Frederick County, James and Baker. Lead militias. Their brother John was a doctor and was involved in some of the medical aspects of the revolution. And then they had a brother Benjamin, who we don't know a lot about because he dies much earlier, and he's a little elusive, but he was also a colonel in the revolution as well. And then Thomas Johnson himself, he is the most political of them all. He starts in Anne Arundel County, even while they own lots of Frederick land. He's still living in Anne Arundel County in his law office. His brothers James and Baker are in the committees of correspondence for Frederick, they're involved in a lot of the local Frederick politics around the Revolution. But Thomas is in the early conventions. He talks a lot about at the very early he just wants some revisions and he wants reconciliation with the mother country, but he serves in all of the Maryland. There's 8 Maryland conventions throughout the American Revolution. He serves in every single one of them. And then he is elected to the First Continental Congress and the Second Continental Congress, though he doesn't finish fully throughout. He leaves before the Declaration is signed, so he's not a member of the Declaration or a signer of the Declaration. But he was really integral in the First Continental Congress in the non-importation pieces and the Continental Association, which every colony signed, agreeing that they would not import British goods. And then in the fall of 1774, they would also, or 1775, they would also stop selling things like tobacco to the British. And he drafted a lot of that and was charged with a lot of the logistics of that non-importation clause. And then at home, he becomes the first elected Maryland governor in 1777. So right after the Declaration is created, all of the colonies become states. And then the General Assembly in Maryland elects Thomas Johnson as the governor. So he spends the next 2 years as the governor, also as brigadier general at the same time, which was a little controversial, and works on kind of strategically finding supplies for Maryland, raising militias, troop movements, basically all of the things about the Revolution in Maryland. And one thing that we like to point out at Rose Hill and are trying to change a little bit of the narrative again, back to the political savvy, is, some of his early biographies and things talk about his love for the state of Maryland. And that's why he didn't sign the Declaration of Independence, because he came back to be governor because he loved Maryland so much. And we kind of like to point out that he became governor because he got to determine who was buying the contracts for supplies for the army. And he just happened to have, several iron furnaces with his brothers that could supply those Dutch ovens and ammunition and guns. So it was definitely very politically and economically important for him to be governor over being in the Continental Congress. So that's kind of him in a nutshell. He does lots of other political things, but those are his really big revolutionary contributions.
Yeah, you mentioned captains of industry earlier. He's definitely exerting some influence there that would be reminiscent of your industrialists in the my favorite time period in the late 19th century, using that political muscle a little bit. Want to pivot again, just something that we haven't talked in too much depth about to this point. And you mentioned, centering the women of Rose Hill as part of the story. Wanted to see if you all would talk through a little bit about how you have integrated the story of the women at Rose Hill, what role they played there, and how you went about telling that story.
So again, using the timeline of the property and kind of looking at the earliest settlers, the German settlers who were on the land, we've started to tell the story about what is it like as a woman to her husband dies when she is pregnant with their child, 8 months pregnant. So what is it like as a woman to lose your husband and then on this earlier landscape of not quite a frontier anymore, but still, a lot of work to be done as a German farmstead. What does that look like, and how do you use your rest of your community to help you and to kind of rally family members and individuals to help you learn to or find ways to support yourself. So we use that story, looking through that timeline again into the Johnson Graham era of the house. Really, the history of the women who were enslaved there gets highlighted a lot through a lot of the stories of the women who were, one of the stories we like to tell is Anne Graham and her enslaved woman. Anne were both raised at her father's house. And when Anne Graham had her son Thomas, she was given Anne, the enslaved woman, to be her wet nurse because her young son Benjamin was only a few months older than Anne's son Thomas. And so looking at that dynamic of those women and their lives and how that changed based on the power that one was given over the other. We also talk a lot about the skilled women in the kitchen and around the farm, and the work that the enslaved women like Miranda and Sarah and Susan are going to be doing in the house and in the kitchen, and what their lives were like. And then later moving into time, looking at the story of the women who were business owners in the time period when the house in the 1920s and 30s was turned into an inn and a tea room, and a way for women to actually earn their income, and what would be considered an acceptable way, that kind of still keeping house kind of idea, but actually entertaining guests. And so looking at two women who had come from Pennsylvania and were running that business there as roadways and all this other development is taking place around them. Inns and tea rooms were popping up, and that was something that they were able, as a woman's owned business, to operate there. And so those are some of the stories that allow us to kind of highlight and center the women into the story as well.
Another piece here to thinking about, mentioned earlier on in the conversation, about how the 200th, the bicentennial of American independence, shaped Rose Hill and its interpretation as a museum. How are you all thinking about 250? Obviously, things are very different between 1976 and what we're looking at in 2026. I'm really curious about, your site with its intense connection to Johnson, to the Johnson family, to American independence. How are you all thinking about the 250th and commemorating that historical event?
Yeah, so at the first level, surprisingly, even though there's a lot about Thomas Johnson, and for 50 years people have been like, oh, Thomas Johnson, and there's streets named and high schools named after him, and even across Maryland, bridges named after him. There's not a lot of understanding about his contributions to the revolution, and why he became this wealthy white man that a lot of people named things after. And so that is one part of it, is to actually kind of bring a different understanding of the American Revolution. I think his involvement adds layers that we often don't get in the surface level understanding of the revolution, because it's all like, there's so much to it, right? You're talking about taxes, and then you're talking about the Continental Army and the battles. And so a lot of the politics and the involvement of merchants and all of that political and business and economic piece of the revolution, I think sometimes isn't always delved into as much. So that's one aspect that we're looking at. But like you talked about, our main focus is looking at the charge of the 250th, of 250 and beyond, and pairing it with this new interpretation of Rose Hill as not a stagnant moment in time, but of 200 years of history. And so we are working on an exhibit that will go through our entire property, and we have 10, about to be 12 exhibit buildings on the property. And so looking at how we incorporate this story of the revolution, not just into the Manor House, but into the barns and the Carriage Museum and all of these other areas. How do the ideas of the revolution impact everything? And so our exhibit will be called In Search of Freedom. and it'll take the ideas juxtapositioned of the Enlightenment ideas that Thomas Johnson and his friends and colleagues are talking about with the Maryland Declaration of Rights and the Declaration of Independence, and juxtaposed to the fact that Thomas Johnson was the second largest enslaver in Frederick County. What those pieces mean, and then beyond that. So in 2027, we will also be celebrating or observing the 200th anniversary of 5 freedom seekers from Rose Hill. And so it's going to be a really natural progression from the 2026. In the exhibit itself, when you go through that timeline piece that Kari was talking about in our exhibits, seeing what it looks like to carry those ideas of the Declaration into the 1820s and into the Civil War. We have one or two members of the enslaved population around the Civil War that were in the USCT. What is the role of abolitionists versus freedom seekers, all of these, the USCT, the Civil War, all of these into continuing to fight for these ideas of freedom that were brought about during the Revolution, and trying to continue to progress those ideas into, like Kari said, the tea room and women's rights and women's suffrage and women's freedom to vote and to have a job that they want and be on their own or get married or not get married. And so all of those ideas continuing into the end of the timeline of Rose Hill, of how the specific stories of each family shows this constant fight for the ideas of the Declaration of Independence.
Amazing. Looking forward to that, and seeing that, and all of the hard work that you all have done, really all coming together and culminating in that. I think visitors are really going to love that. Thinking of visitors and listeners to the podcast, if they're intrigued by what they're hearing and they want to plan a trip or want to support the work that you are all doing there, what are some ways that they can support or come out to events? What's going on there at Rose Hill?
Yeah, so we are open for just walk-in visitors and guided or self-guided tours, Thursdays through Sundays from April until September, and then on the weekends in October, November, and December. And then we have several different special events throughout the year that they can find on our website, recreator.com. But we have a living history weekend in August that's very popular, that kind of mirrors that timeline of the history of the park. We have some more children's museums. We have lots of programs, lots of family-centered events, like our Trick or Treat Through History, Museums by Candlelight. So we have pretty much every season, we have some kind of special event that is usually family-friendly, and then our regular open hours and different programming.
Excellent. Well, we're going to leave it there for now. Thank you both so much for coming on the show today. We really appreciated your insights and sharing the history of Rose Hill.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us for this week's episode of Public History with Jake and Justin. It was a real pleasure to speak with Amanda and Kari about the important work happening at Rose Hill Manor Park and Museums. If you're enjoying the podcast, we'd be grateful if you left a rating and a review wherever you listen. And don't forget to give us a thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube. We've got some exciting episodes coming your way soon as we explore more stories at the intersection of history, community, and memory. Until next time, keep asking good questions, keep visiting your local museums, and we'll talk to you again soon.